would be taking place in the apartment of another local bookie and convict, Jimmy Meehan. Now, Rothstein preferred playing dice, and so as a condition of joining Titanic in this game, he insisted they play as partners. With the deal made, the pair headed to Meehan's apartment, where around midnight other gamblers like Martin Red Bow, Joe Bernstein, and Abe Silverman, among others, began to gather. These were men who would reliably show up whenever there were high-stakes bets to be made. Indeed, there would be no chips used to bet in this game. It was all cash with no limits. And so, once everyone had gathered, the game began, and for the first couple of hours, Titanic was good to his word, as he secretly partnered with Rothstein just like he'd often done with Nick the Greek in Chicago and California. As such, it appeared to the rest of the men at the table that Titanic and Rothstein were like them playing for themselves. The thing was, the two were secretly signaling one another what they had in their hands, so that the one with the better cards would stay in while the other bowed out, typically after making sure to raise the stakes before they did. As a result, the pair were reportedly up something like $15,000 when a Jewish gambler named Nathan Raymond arrived. Nathan was more commonly known as N-Word Nate, due to his frizzy hair and reported attraction to black women, just so we all remember what era we're in here. Terrible racial politics aside, Nate was supposed to have arrived earlier, but he claimed to have been too busy winning $8,000 playing dice, and was now looking to increase his winnings. The truth was, though, this wasn't some random arrival, but a part of Titanic's plan to take down Rothstein. You see, Nate wasn't just another gambler, as he and Titanic had crossed paths back in the Kingston Club in California, and Nate had actually made the trip out to New York explicitly to take part in this plan. For Rothstein and the others, though, none of this seemed odd, because Nate had a well-known reputation as a gambler, and so he was invited to the table without a second thought. Rothstein, then perhaps thinking Nate easy prey or simply unable to help himself, seemingly pounced as soon as Nate sat down at the table. Hoping to claim the $8,000 Nate had just bragged about winning at dice, Rothstein encouraged the other man to bet his winnings on who could pull the higher card from the deck. Now, this was more or less the kind of thing Titanic had been anticipating. So, seeing as how the Roman gambler had promised Nate ahead of time that it would cover any losses he suffered luring Rothstein into their trap, he accepted the bet. Nate, though, would win the draw, and so Rothstein now owed him $8,000. In the end, though, the outcome really wasn't all that important. What was important was Rothstein's actions gave Titanic an excuse to pull him aside and end their partnership, as he told Rothstein that he could not partner with someone who was so reckless that he would bet so much money on a high card draw. A bet where the odds weren't really in your favor. He only partnered with smart gamblers, so from here on out they would each be going it alone. There was likely some risk here that Rothstein could have just walked away at this point, as he wasn't a major poker player, much preferring dice, and had only agreed to the game if Titanic would partner with him. However, it seems like once he had started gambling, Rothstein had a hard time walking away. So, despite their partnership ending, and his luck subsequently seemed to go downhill almost immediately, Rothstein kept playing. Now, to be clear, this change in luck was anything but happenstance. The reality was Titanic wasn't so much going it on his own as he was actually orchestrating a grand scheme to take Rothstein for all he could. Indeed, soon enough, the plan wouldn't just involve Nate and Titanic, but also all the other men at the table as well, as Titanic spoke to them surreptitiously, promising to cut them in and cover their losses as long as they always bet the same way Nate did, as Nate was his true partner in this game, and the one who would do the lion's share of the winning so as to not make Rothstein suspicious of Titanic. Time and again, then, Rothstein would come just short of winning when it came to both his hands and his side bets. Still, he kept betting and losing as the game carried on through the night into the next morning and throughout that day as well. Such marathon sessions were not that uncommon among this type of professional gambler. Now, some of the men would take breaks during this time to wash their face, get a sandwich, or even lay down for a few hours before rejoining the game. Booker Jimmy Meehan, whose apartment they were playing in, though, upon realizing that he was in well over his head with such a crowd, actually went and attended the first game of the World Series. Still, the poker game carried on, and despite losing more often than not, or maybe because of it, Rothstein kept pushing forward. If anything, he was clearly growing more reckless with each loss, as by dawn Monday morning, Rothstein was reportedly betting tens of thousands of dollars per hand in a desperate attempt to make up for his losses. The game in all would last for 30 hours before Rothstein finally admitted he had been beaten. only doing so though after one final $40,000 high card bet, which he of course lost. Over the course of those 30 hours then, Rothstein had lost a reported $475,000, which comes to about $8.5 million today. Rothstein had by far lost most of that money to Nate, who had won several $100,000 over the course of those 30 hours, while the others at the table had won in the neighborhood of tens of thousands of dollars off of Rothstein. As for Titanic, he had won a few hands here and there, but his winnings at the table were nowhere near what Nate had won. The reality was, though, Titanic's cut of everything came out to roughly $250,000. Now, to be clear, Rothstein hadn't lost every hand he played after Titanic had ended their partnership. He had won a few games here and there, with George "Hump" McManus being the one man he consistently beat to the tune of $51,000. Yet, just like Titanic purposely not winning too much, McManus's losses seemed to have been all a part of the plan to keep Rothstein playing, and to disguise the fact that he was being cheated left and right. The problem here was no one at the table had actually gotten any of Rothstein's money, even though he admitted that he had been beaten as he left. You see, while Rothstein always insisted on collecting his winnings and cashing immediately, he had long had a habit of writing out slips of paper for how much he had wagered and lost, with the promise being that he would pay off those debts eventually. Now, after some time, Rothstein would come to believe he had been cheated, even if he was not exactly clear on how it had happened. Still, though, the expectation among gamblers was you would pay your debts regardless of if you were cheated or not. In fact, the general wisdom was you would pay your debts even when cheated, because you did not want to draw attention to the fact that you had been fooled. The problem for Rothstein, though, was he simply did not have the cash available at the time to cover his losses at the poker table, as his money was currently all tied up. In addition to having to pay smugglers and distributors to keep his illegal business going, he also had to pay any number of cops to keep them looking the other way. And then there was the $550,000 bet he had on the outcome of two major elections taking place that year. He had bet big that Herbert Hoover would become the next president of the United States, and that Franklin Roosevelt would become New York's next governor. Both, as it turns out, were smart bets, and he stood to make quite a bit of money as a result. The men he owed money to then, Rothstein decided, were just going to have to wait until November and be happy about it. Yet, as the house for the game, George "Hump" McManus had the responsibility of making sure the participants paid up. So, after 8 weeks passed with no signs from Rothstein that he intended to pay up, and with the others growing anxious, McManus decided the time had come to scare Rothstein into paying what he owed. So, on the 4th of November 1928, McManus called up Rothstein asking to meet in room 349 at the Park Central Hotel. Rothstein then left his offices and proceeded down to the hotel, where he paused outside and handed his gun over to his friend Jimmy Meehan, whose apartment the fateful game had taken place in. Rothstein knew full well that this meeting would be about his gambling debts from their marathon card game back in September, debts that he wasn't able to pay back just yet. He also knew they were going to try and scare him, and in such circumstances, it would be best to not have a gun himself lest he react poorly and make the situation worse. After handing his gun over then, Rothstein told Meehan to go get himself a drink, as he wouldn't be long. Meanwhile, up in room 349, George "Hump" McManus was waiting with 3 men, including one Hyman Gilly Biller, who was the hard case that McManus relied upon to collect the money that was owed to him. When Rothstein arrived, McManus reportedly said something along the lines of, quote, "Mayor, I'm getting a lot of static from some of the boys you owe money to. Some of them are anxious to get out of town back home, and they're crying on my shoulder for their money." To which Rothstein reportedly replied, quote, "Let the bastards cry. They cheated me, and I don't like that a bit." McManus, of course, insisted that there had been no cheating, and Rothstein had to pay up. At which point Rothstein supposedly admitted that he couldn't pay them right now, and so they would have to wait until after the election, which was only 2 days away. With Rothstein showing no signs of blinking, McManus then tried to turn the heat up a bit as he pulled a gun out of a drawer and pointed it at the other man. In fact, the other 3 men in the room reportedly also pulled their guns on Rothstein, as McManus insisted that he had to make good on his IOUs. Now, supposedly, this was to simply scare Rothstein a bit and encourage him to pay up. That was it. Rothstein, though, didn't seem to be shaken. Instead, he reportedly simply stood up and made clear his intentions to leave, as he calmly said, quote, "Good night, Hump." Now, what happened next is in dispute, as no one really knows, and those who did were not willing to talk. Some, for example, believe that McManus, who had been drinking in the lead up to this meeting, simply lost his cool and shot Rothstein, something that may have happened following a struggle for the gun. Meanwhile, others like Titanic Thomas, as he would reveal decades later, believe the actual triggerman was Hyman Gilly Biller, who was the hard case typically responsible for collecting debts for McManus. Regardless, Arnold Rothstein, the man who had rigged the World Series and who had been a pivotal figure in turning organized crime into a massively successful business during Prohibition, now stumbled out of room 349, having been shot in the groin. Meanwhile, at the same moment, a reportedly attractive woman named Marion Putnam was waiting for an elevator on the third floor of the Park Central Hotel when a strange man lurched down the hall toward her holding his groin. Frightened and not knowing what was wrong with this man or what he intended to do, Marion fled back to her room. As for Rothstein, rather than wait for the elevator, he instead managed to make his way down the nearby surface stairs to the hotel lobby, where he was said to have weakly proclaimed he had been shot as he requested a taxi and a doctor. Now, a Detective Patrick Flood was in the area, and so he would be the first to arrive on the scene. Flood recognized Rothstein immediately and asked what had happened and who had shot him. Arnold, though, would stick to the code of the underworld, as he refused to tell the cops anything including the identity of the man who had shot and likely killed him, something that Rothstein was clearly quite aware of, as in addition to asking for a cab and a doctor, he also asked for his will. As these scenes were playing out inside the hotel, a blue-barreled Colt 38 was crashing to the street just outside, landing close enough to cab driver Al Bender, who had been sitting on the hood of his car, for him to hear the impact of the gun hitting the pavement. Curious, Al went over to investigate the sound and the object that he had seen glinting in the streetlights as it slid across the sidewalk. After tracking the object down and not knowing what it was, the taxi driver picked it up, never imagining that it would be a gun, much less one that had just been a part of a major crime. In doing so, Al ended up putting his fingerprints all over it, thereby ruining any that may have been there before. Rothstein, meanwhile, would also be of no help, as even as he lay dying in the hospital, he continually refused to cooperate with the cops. In fact, it said his main response to being asked who had shot him seemed to have involved simply putting his finger to his lips. The 46-year-old Rothstein would then take the identity of the man who had shot him to his grave, as he died just one day before the election that would have seen him winning over $500,000. Yet, even without Rothstein's help, the cops still had a pretty obvious suspect in McManus, who, even though he had registered room 349 under the name George Richards, in his haste to leave had left behind a velvet-collared overcoat which had in one of its pockets a handkerchief bearing the monogram GM, which, to be fair, didn't 100% prove whose coat it was, but the fact that the coat's lining had the name George McManus embroidered in it did give the police a pretty good clue on who to look for. Also not helping George's case was the fact that when the cops went to search the McManus home, he wasn't there, and it appeared as if he had packed things very quickly, as if he had been in quite a hurry to leave. It certainly looked then that they had a pretty open and shut case. Despite this, the Arnold Rothstein murder trial would not begin for over a year, finally getting underway on the 22nd of November 1929. There were multiple reasons for this delay, but one of the most recent ones involved none other than the man known as Titanic, who had previously agreed to testify on the state's behalf in return for getting his bail reduced from $100,000 to just $10,000. After making this agreement, though, he and Alice, who had joined him in the city, reportedly made their way west, with the intention of checking out his recently won Milwaukee restaurant and speakeasy, the Golden Pheasant. Then, when it came time to return to the city to testify as he had agreed, Titanic would try to weasel out of his agreement by claiming he was too ill to make the trip, which caused the trial to be delayed a week as the court opted to wait instead of carrying on without him. In fact, 2 New York detectives would actually be dispatched to Milwaukee to confirm that Titanic Thomas had actually been hospitalized like he claimed. As a result, Titanic was ultimately left with little choice, and eventually showed up in the New York City courtroom to testify. That being said, Titanic would be nowhere near as useful as the prosecution hoped he would be, as while he would vaguely describe the poker game he and Rothstein had been involved in, he claimed he could not remember the last time he had seen McManus, which the prosecution found hard to believe, but Titanic would claim he had always had a bad memory, giving, for example, a time when he had won $10,000 betting on a horse, only to be completely unable to recall its name the very next day. To be clear though, Titanic was far from alone in being of no use, as seemingly every one of the string of gamblers called to give testimony offered little to no help